Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to introduce to you the final part of our today's program, the premiere of the film We Lived in the 9th District. That will be presented also as a video installation in our showroom facing the street. But the film screening we will witness is not only, as you already have heard, or you can imagine, an extension of the current exhibition, Documents of Injustice, the Case of Freud. It's also a contribution to the Art Week, the Vienna Art Week. We have been a part since years of. And it is a great pleasure for me to have Thomas Kohut on my side, who will speak about the film after the screening with you and with me. And as you have already heard it, as a renowned historian and son of the later psychoanalyst Heinz Kohut, the bitter consequences of the Holocaust and the Second World War are part of his life, both in two sides, professionally as well as personally. And before we start the screening, let me give you some very brief information about its origin. The film is a result of a long-lasting friendship and cooperation with Stephen Naron, director of the Fortunoff Archive for Holocaust Testimonies, and together with the historian Julie Dawson, I think she's here, and the filmmaker Ambrus Hernádi, Naron conceptualized a wonderful film document that is very close, because the protagonists of the film represent, in a way, the four sisters, and you have heard they were deported and murdered in Theresienstadt and Treblinka. But the four survivors we will listen to in the film, so they represent Rosa, Adolfine, Maria and Pauline, and so many others who did not survive.
My father had a grocery store. We lived in the 20th district, which was sort of a lower middle class, working class district. I went to elementary school there. We had about, I would say, 80% Christian children and 20% Jewish children. I was a very happy-go-lucky child there. I never felt any sort of discriminations. We were all friends, and as young children, I even observed some of the Christian holidays with them in school, because this is the way it was. But I was always fully aware that I was Jewish.
We lived in a pretty inner city district, in the 9th district, which was, how shall I say, mixed. For instance, the apartment house where I was born and lived the first 12 years of my life was very interesting. It was like a little city in itself. It wasn't just people of one religion or of one economic level. It was very mixed. There was a cobbler who lived there, and there were the people that owned a beautiful bookstore downtown, and there was a doctor, and there were some retired old ladies that lived evidently quite comfortably. And so it was a great mixture of people, Jewish and not Jewish, and younger and older, and
'n' 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 '
And this is rather unusual. I don't think you find that here necessarily. I don't know whether it's today that way anymore, but Vienna was known to be pretty integrated in living anyway. We lived an average life. We were not well-to-do. We lived in an apartment. My mother was a couturière, a dressmaker, a master dressmaker, and she had her studio in the apartment. My maternal grandmother lived with us, and in spite of this modest way of living, we had a maid, like everybody had a maid. That didn't mean that we were wealthy, but there was a maid. I attended schools. My elementary school was a Franz Schubert Schule in Vienna.
My family and my brother, Kurt, who is 9 years older than I am, lived in a very lovely, spacious apartment in a 4-story apartment house on the Nickelgasse number 1 in the 2nd district of Vienna. Our apartment was on the 2nd floor, door number 7. I had a wonderful, very, very extremely happy childhood. My family, the household of my parents was strictly Orthodox, kosher. We belonged to one of the most Orthodox synagogues in the 2nd district of Vienna. It was called the Schiffschule, which it was located in the Schiffgasse or Schiff Street. As a child, I had a group of really incredible boys and girls as friends when I grew up. My parents, although being very Orthodox and religious, they were very tolerant and very broad-minded, and they never objected that I would have non-Jewish friends. So they didn't mind, they didn't object of me going even to, I remember so well, going to a midnight mass Christmas Eve, because they felt, well, that's part of education, world education. And I remember that so well, and I also remember helping my non-Jewish friends decorate the Christmas trees, and that was fun. And then in turn, for Passover, my mother made matzo balls by the hundreds of dozens, and we gave to all of our non-Jewish friends plates of matzo balls with instructions how to cook them. And so it really was a very liberal and wonderful childhood for me.
Holidays were observed. I really felt deprived not being able to have a Christmas tree, because to me that looked very beautiful. Religious instruction was part of the school curriculum, and so the teachers came into the school and the class divided up into the 3 religions. There were maybe 2 children in the class that were without religion, and it was called confessionslos, which means without affiliation.
I remember that dreadful Friday of March the 11th, 1938, a night I shall never forget. My father and brother came home from shul, from the synagogue, and Friday night dinner was served, and my grandmother didn't come that Friday night because we all had an inkling something was brewing, something I mean, after all, we read the newspapers, we knew what was coming. But And I must tell you, in our household, on Friday night or Shabbos, the radio was never played. But that night, the radio was turned on because we needed to know what was coming. And sure enough, we heard the speech of the then president of the country of Austria, Dr. Kurt von Schuschnigg, where he told the country that he is surrendering Austria to Hitler and the Germans. He does not want to shed any Austrian blood, therefore he is surrendering. And when we heard that, my mother was just horrified. The first thing, and I remember this so well, she said, well, this is the end. This is the end for us. This is the beginning of the end. And of course, that was a terrible situation. No one knew what to do next. Where do we go from here? And it was unbelievable. You cannot imagine the instant change in people. It seemed like the Austrians were ready for it. It seemed like the Austrians, policemen even, had their banner in their pockets to put on their arm with the big swastika. It hurt me as a child so terribly how my non-Jewish friends immediately were told that they couldn't play with me, they couldn't call me, and how they turned against me. And that was the day of the Anschluss, the famous Anschluss. Well, things were so bad that, for instance, my brother, who was already studying at the university, medical school, could not go to the university to pick up his papers because Jews were not permitted to enter the building. I couldn't go and play in my beloved park, which was just 15, 20 minutes away from my house, because there was a big sign on the entrance posted, dogs and Jews are not permitted. Benches in the park had painted overnight. This all happened overnight.
And then, of course, in March of 1938, Hitler invaded Austria, and I remember that night very clearly. It was a Friday night, and I used to go to services on Friday night. I insisted on going, and my parents, evidently knowing that something was up, absolutely forbade me to go. You can't possibly. So I stayed home, and as we sat there and listened to the radio, we realized what was happening. The troops were marching into Austria. They were received with open arms. All this talk about Hitler annexing Austria is really just talk. They were well prepared. They were in uniform already. And even as a 17-year-old, I realized that my life was to change completely. We knew that right away.
It was a Friday night, and we came from the synagogue, and that was the question about Schuschnigg abdicating. And after services we had dinner, and then I went to my friend's house, and there we heard on the radio Schuschnigg's abdication, and they were playing the hymn. I never forget this. With a violin, you know. That's, I don't know, you know, it's called Gott erhalte. That was the hymn of Austria. And the violin played it, and Schuschnigg abdicated and said, God bless Austria. That was, then they marched in. I dressed usually in a skirt and a blue sweater and a white blouse. I looked like the other BDM, the Bund Deutsche Mädchen. So personally, I had no trouble, you know. But it was terribly traumatic. You just could not possibly understand it here, that you have the feeling that there is no law for you. None. In Austria, it was much worse than Germany, because it happened overnight. In Germany, it took from 1933 up. By the 1938, they were taught by the Austrian how to be real Nazis. Because in 1933 it happened in Germany, and they lived quite comfortable in 1937. They didn't even think of leaving because they thought maybe it'll change. So my father, they went into the store and confiscated whatever they wanted. It was a free for all. And he was in the Austrian army, so he held his certificate in front of the store. They should leave him alone. But it didn't help. So they closed the store up.
We lived there until somebody came and wanted our apartment. Yeah. Somebody who had a right to demand, to request. And so we had to leave, and we left everything actually there in the apartment and moved to my aunt's apartment, which was actually nicer than ours and bigger, and she lived there alone. She was widowed at that time. And it was in the same district, in the same area. And we lived with her. The four of us moved in there, and from there my father was being deported, only men's transport, and we stayed there until somebody came and wanted that apartment as well. Yeah. And then we had to move again. You know, when people are asking, how could they let themselves be marched into the camps and all that? And people have absolutely no idea of the gradual closing in of the gradual dehumanization. Mm-hmm. I mean, at first you leave your apartment and you go to another apartment, which isn't so bad. And then eventually the fear of raids, of constant raids, and so already had gone, and this one had gone, and that one had gone. So it was diminishing, and the circle was drawing closer and closer to us. And we were one of the very late departures. We were shipped out in October of 42, the four of us, my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother, and I, were taken and sent to Theresienstadt, to Theresien, because she worked for the Jewish community. And usually people were sent to Theresienstadt from Vienna if they had any connection either with the Jewish community or if they were war veterans from the First World War. Arrival there was really, I would say, traumatic. I don't remember the train ride, but I remember when we got there. And they put us into houses. I don't know whether you know about Theresien. It was a garrison town.
Yes.
And it was a walled city of 1 square kilometer. It was, the Nazis considered it evidently ideal for a camp because it was self-contained. And the civilian population had to leave. They put us into this house, formerly a private house, and we had to go up to the attic. And it was the most horrible thing. I remember, first of all, it smelled vile from some disinfectant. And there was a bundle lying there in the hallway, turned out to be a corpse. And upstairs, when we came up, there were people there, and sick and horrible. It was terrifying. It was the first time that we were really separated from a civilized environment.
Ja, das war die Premiere. And I would like to thank the Fortunoff Archive, Stephen Naron and Julie Dawson. Where's Julie Dawson? Thank you very much. Because I think you had to go through hours and hours of materials, thousands of interviews, and you compiled a wonderful, very impressive film document. Thank you again. And also Ambrus Hernádi's award for me as an art historian is also impressive, are the white noise in between. So when I saw it, the white noise in between opens up space for thoughts, and it's quite close to the concept of the Sigmund Freud Museum. We realized dealing with the empty space that remained after Freud was forced to leave, as is also this emptiness that tells a lot. And I mentioned it before, the film will be presented at the showcase facing the street, in the showroom. It's called Showroom Berggasse 19. Normally it's a place for contemporary art installations. And it's very crucial to me, this way of presentation, because all Vienna citizens and people who pass the show window, visitors of the Freud Museum, but also Vienna citizens will see and listen to former Vienna citizens. And this interruption of our daily life might have an impact. And I'm the descendant of the perpetrator generation. And also for me, or I don't know, in a very special way, I experienced the great impact listening to the stories that such an oral history project can have. Because also if the Holocaust and the experience of the Shoah is not part of my family story, there were so many things we share. You realize that you share also after so many generations, decorating a Christmas tree. So we know how it feels to walk through the streets of the 9th district. And it's again what you negotiated before, the sharing of the memory of a place that still looks the same after 8 years. So I think that's really worth to think about these shared memories, because they bring a kind of identification. And so not as a descendant of the perpetrators, but also as just a human being, you share a lot. And that makes some kind of a real special understanding. In German we would say begreifen. So it's a very specific kind of knowledge that goes hand in hand with this inner pictures and feelings that such an oral history project can evoke. So what do you think about this everyday and the little things, the daily things?
So I obviously, it's probably fairly familiar to me listening to survivors talk about their experiences. And so it's maybe a little different for me than for some of you, but I think what probably, one thing I just noticed that maybe a non-American or English-speaking audience wouldn't have picked up was that they speak English with a German accent, every single one of them. And there were also various phrases that were German phrases in English. The word order was German. And there's something very moving about that, about the fact that, the place, the Vienna, is still a part of them, even though they were torn away from it in a terrible way and have lived, obviously, for decades in the United States. So that was one thing that really I found moving. Again, it goes without saying for me, because my father had an accent when he spoke English too, and every single refugee that I've known spoke English with in some cases, Viennese accent. So there's something it's a little subtle thing, but that's about place and loss and preservation of a lost place in how you speak and how you think and who you are. So that was one thing, I guess. The other thing, I don't know I'd be really interested to hear what the audience thought. I thought one of the things that's very vivid in the interviews is the image of them all listening to Schuschnigg talk about the end of Austria. And there was something, there was again a kind of I found that really moving to hear that. That's not my phone. So anyway, that I found that sort of really interesting. And again, this may be, Julie, you maybe can respond to this, may know it, having seen the interviews, but it was striking, given the panel and the whole topic of this event, that they all began to talk about place. Maybe that was the first question that was posed to them. It's very possible, because if you listen to oral histories, are very much determined by the questions that are asked, the environment that is in which they take place. But it did strike me as really, it was striking how that's where they began, to the point where the one talked about which Stiege and which
Yes.
apartment number, and they were locating themselves in place that they were torn away from, basically. And the other thing that I found very, like having seen it now 3 times, but the big screen makes it more moving. Some of the things they said were really insightful, about the difference between Austria and Germany, around the relatively sudden transformation in Austria and the gradual tightening of the noose in Germany. That was an important. And the last comment, which again, Julie, I think you may be responsible for it, was just so profound about when the interviewee arrived in Theresienstadt, she left civilization and came into a wholly dehumanized environment. Again, I found that really, really moving. Again, I'm a historian and I actually know a fair amount about the history of all this. And the one thing I'm not skeptical about, but I thought the description of Austria before the Anschluss, I thought it was again nostalgia for an idealized place. I think Austria before the Anschluss was a pretty hard place for Jews to live, and I think there was a lot of anti-Semitism. And it depends on one's historical perspective, but I'm a historian who believes that history is not made simply from the top down, but from the bottom up as well, and that their descriptions of what happened with the Anschluss and how the Austrians were ready, that was one of the lines in there. The anti-Semitism in Austria, particularly in Vienna, was really, really bad and much worse than in Germany, I would say. And there was, it wasn't mentioned there, although it was alluded to, with the Anschluss, there was a pogrom in Vienna. It was a completely spontaneous, popular pogrom against Jews. And the Nazi authorities, I now know, many historians know this, but from my own research I've encountered, were trying desperately to stop this and to rein in the popular acts of violence against Jews, because the Nazis, not that they liked Jews, but they wanted the property preserved. They didn't want it destroyed. They hoped that they could and expected to acquire it. But there was no act of violence in Germany comparable to what happened in March of 1938 until Kristallnacht, which is important to know is tomorrow. The anniversary is tomorrow. So that was something, again, I think that may reflect a bit of an effort to communicate to the audience, but mostly to themselves, what they had lost by talking about how nice it was before the Anschluss. But this gets back to the earlier discussion about people needing to remember places positively and having Austria be, because the positive memories of Austria that they talked about represents the fact that Vienna was really very important to them and meant a lot to them, and it gets reflected in the way they speak at the times of the interviews. So I guess that's really, I don't have any other particular, I think everyone in this audience can say insightful things about what they got out of watching those interviews.
Thank you, Tom. So I think we will start with comments from the audience.
Well, I think one thing is, and I had seen a documentary at the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York. If you listen to the inflection, which is Viennese German, they are as ordinary as any Viennese from their neighborhood. There's no way you would know specifically if you met them on the street. They really look like anybody. So I think that's particularly gripping, and to hear the inflection, which is from their district, the Viennese German that is spoken there. Mm. And as to the nostalgia, I think it's very mixed. I don't think, and I'm thinking of the United States now, what's happening to undocumented people who are brown, who speak Spanish, who may be citizens, who are being taken away, dehumanized. It's what is terrifying is how easy it is to do that. So
And I think also the aspect that Thea, I think, described of this slowly diminishing of human rights, of a law for us. So that always reminds us on that what we want to show in the special exhibition, because it's about the documents of injustice. And we experience this today, I think that also, yeah. Da ist die, hallo.
Hello, it is great to be here. Thank you so much. I was at the Yad Vashem in Israel a couple years ago, and watching the Holocaust Museum, which remembers, and I remember like still, you know, I grew up in South America, and I still was trying to put the dots together of like how in the world. You know, like what she was saying, like people ask her, one of the ladies in the film, like, why do you keep going from apartment to apartment? I always had that question too, and finally kind of became clear to me, you know, psychologically, they were in shock. You know, it was such a shock for them, and this gradual dehumanization just finally reached, you know, in the concentration camps, it kind of reached the cusp, and it's a question that I always had as a little girl growing up in Latin America, and then got to be friends with many Jewish people in New York, and you know, it finally rang today through this film, you know, that it's that dehumanization took its time psychologically, and it was a gradual decline of the appreciation for their own humanity in a way, influenced by their environment. Anyway, this was great, thank you.
One of the ladies showed the glorification of the past when she mentioned the Austrian hymn. It had the same melody as the German at that time, but in Austria it was played in a philharmonic way, and the Germans played it with drums and trumpets. And it did not start with Gott erhalte, that was the hymn of the empire, but it started with Heimat Erde Wunderhold. And she remembered even the glorious days of the empire.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah.
That made me sad actually when she mentioned that. It really was poignant.
Yeah, it was part of her identification. Yeah.
Also, Schuschnigg is once remembered at Kurt von Schuschnigg.
Yes.
And not Kurt Schuschnigg.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes also in this direction. Yeah.
But she must have been very young. So she was young when she experienced that. She was just a child. So, no? So a lot of friends of mine are Jewish descendants of victims living in the United States. Especially they tell about these family traditions. Mm-hmm. Baking special cakes, Viennese, cooking and so on and so forth. That makes also the identity.
And lots of Jews had Christmas trees.
Yes, like Freud.
Yeah.
Freud had a Christmas tree.
Yeah, the one comment you were mentioning, the United States, and it's hard not to think about it, but the thing that's there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Austria, I would say more than in Germany, but what really was unusual about National Socialism in Central Europe was that there was a popular sentiment, a hostility to Jews, but there was for the first time a state wholly committed to an anti-Semitic agenda that then gave license, official sanction, as it were, to the popular anti-Semitism that was there already. So that's how it sometimes seems like a switch was flicked in 1933, in January 30th, 1933, in Nazi Germany and with the Anschluss in Austria. And in a sense, it was a switch flicked, but it was kind of alighting the circuits that had already been were already lying on the ground, and that I think that's just again important to remember when you think about the point you made about how fast it can happen. It can happen very fast when there's something underneath the popular sentiment that is in tune with a state that suddenly sanctions inhuman behavior, basically.
But Tom, do you think there's a difference? Yesterday I heard also about Germany that the AfD tries to influence what is taught at the schools. Like we hear since months and years to say that the content, what is taught in your schools in America is bestimmt.
Or they try, yes.
Yeah, by the state.
It tries.
And
hopefully
it gets
we resist.
It gets a lot of positive response from the people who vote Trump, who vote the AfD. So there's a huge amount of people who are voting for these people. We don't have to forget, and we have to face that. So I think it's not a big difference, I'm afraid. What do you think?
I mean, I think we call it inhuman, but it is part of human.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And this is one of Freud's big contributions, that we have to be civilized. We're not born civilized. It's extremely important. So, I don't know, I take issue when we say inhuman. Unfortunately, we are predator animals. That's just part of our DNA. The thing also, I'm sorry, I'm beginning to lose my train a little, but the fear of the other and then labeling the other is what becomes so dangerous. It's the othering of people, that person is no longer part of the general society because of history, what we call ethnicity or race. And then that person is now part of a non-group of the whole. And that's something very human, unfortunately, too, throughout history, and something that Freud was also writing about. Identification with the aggressor, how the victim repeats, can become the aggressor become the victim, and vice versa. So after the war, Austria became the victim state, which is very unfortunately understandable, the way people switch things around.
But I hope it will work out also.
We have to resist, as you said.
Yeah, we have to resist. Yeah. So, do you think that playing the film on the street
I think it's good.
would have an impact?
Well, it reminds me, this is when we were here before the pandemic, but there was a big exhibition of the huge faces of survivors along the Ringstrasse.
Yes.
And it was very similar, instead of taking the, numbers or hearing about, statistics or even watching old grainy black and white films of the liberation of Dachau, for example, or Buchenwald, that's the one that's really pretty appalling. That was a really, I thought, effective exhibition. And, as some of you may remember, there were people defaced it, and a group of lots of young people camped out overnight, including lots of Muslim Austrians, to protect those things. And I think it's very similar to, and as was mentioned at the opening here, I think, there's now a wall in near the university where the name of every Jew who was killed in the Holocaust, including my relatives, is there to see. And the other place that I think that I found that made me feel good to see the relatives there a bit. But the place that I think one needs to go to see is the Aspang Bahnhof. And there's a memorial there because at most virtually all the Jews, including the women that were deported in the film, were deported from the S-Bahn-Bahnhof. And it sits in the middle of, near the Rennweg, and it's sort of a nondescript place, but to remember that that was the last place that most of these people were in the place of Vienna before they were taken to the, sorry, but it's her word, the uncivilized world dehumanizing world. That's maybe the better world, then, because human beings are doing all this to each other. The dehumanized world of the camps.
It seemed like all four of the testimonies were people who ended up in the U.S., and I wonder what the testimonies would be like of those who went to Canada or UK or to Latin America or to Israel, and they had a totally new project in Israel of constructing a new state. Is there any reason that these were the testimonies that were very powerful? It was great.
Maybe Julie can answer that one.
Thank you. I'll come up, so I'm not at the very back. Well, the Fortunoff Archive, we worked with testimonies from the Fortunoff Archive, which is based at Yale. And so they began this process of collecting these testimonies, so it's really actually just a geographic reason. That was the Holocaust Oral History Testimonies Archive that we worked with. But there obviously are, and almost all of their testimonies are from people in the United States. There's a large majority from the East Coast. So if you were to do an empirical project, you have to expand to taking in, in the meantime, there's a lot of other archival oral histories repositories. So,
how many interviews, testimonies?
Well, I began with over 300 that had some sort of Vienna tag. So I didn't listen to all 300 because first I just looked to see if they were actually then in Vienna or if they passed through Vienna at some time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sort of went from there. I won't explain the whole process. But
and then you had to...
And then I went down from there, yeah. So, and I decided at one point in time then to definitely just do women. And I will respond to this space, your comment about space, as someone who lives in Vienna and has my age. Sorry, I have a baby, so I'm still hormonal. But my children are growing up here and going to schools here. I'm always attracted to space, ideas of space, and I work with this in my own work. And I definitely intentionally try to pull the testimonies that where they had vivid impressions of their homes or their schools. The last woman, I didn't choose her for this, but the woman who talked about the hymn, which I also found very interesting. She lives in the street where my children go to school.
Oh, really?
So, and actually it was interesting because at first it was recorded in the transcript with the wrong street. And I looked up, I said, this street doesn't exist. Like, what is this? And so I went and listened to her, and whoever had done the transcript didn't speak German. And then I realized that's Vereinsgasse, so the second. And then I thought, oh my God, it's right around the corner from our house, So I pulled these on purpose, the ones that had a lot of space reference, but that being said, most of them did, almost everybody talked about where they lived. Mm-hmm. And also regarding the anti-Semitism, the pogroms, and also the Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, we had excerpts from these incidents, and at some point in time we just decided that the film needed to be short so that it could sort of reach more people, and so things got cut. We began with over an hour of material and cut it down lower. And then there's one more thing I wanted to say about the positive memories, the nostalgia. Of course, there were also many people that said things like, well, actually, I just grew up with anti-Semitism, or it was, I only had Jewish friends, or something like this. But I thought that I feel like those kinds of stories are a little bit more stereotypical, or that more known in some way. And I was really struck by these women, in particular, this one who came from the Orthodox family who went to Mass. You know, I mean, I feel like even today you just don't hear about this kind of thing happening anymore, and maybe it doesn't happen as much. And I was really struck by these sort of integration, as the one woman talked about. Yeah.
I'm very grateful that you choose that part also, because what is also very interesting for us, because it make the whole piece very present and current, because we experienced that. So my children grew up in a public kindergarten, and I let them go in a public kindergarten because they meet a lot of very different people there. It was a decision to do that, not to choose a private kindergarten, to choose a public one. And so they have this experience. And if they would see the film, they met also testimonies at school, of course, but if they see the film, they will have the same thing. It's also for the next generations who only know that from their grandmother's stories, and so that to have something to share and to be alert.
So one thing I'd like to say is that we're talking about place and the importance of place, and I don't know quite how to say this, but there's something about Vienna that is really wonderful as far as enabling us to imagine ourselves in the place of the Jews who were persecuted, because in contrast to Germany, Vienna was not savagely bombed, and you cannot find in Germany the places where all these events occurred. But for the most part, we live where we're living now in Vienna is like 2 blocks from the Berggasse, where the Freud sisters were interred before they were sent to Theresienstadt. These places, the Aspang Bahnhof was bombed, but most of the other place, or actually was torn down. I'm sorry, it was torn down in the 70s, I think. Unfortunately, it should have been left. But these are places you can go to and see, and you can see where the Gestapo headquarters were in the Hotel Metropole. That's right at the Schwedenplatz, and there's a little marker for it. And it's a way that you can, like these interviews, you can really feel the history, because you can imagine yourself in these places, because you can be in these places. And that's something that I have never experienced in Germany, partly because Germany was just so severely destroyed in the war in ways that Vienna wasn't.
Okay. Thank.
No, I know, but the spot is there.
Yeah.
The spot is there.
You know.
And I believe there was a big Gestapo prison in the Rossauer Lande.
Okay. Stephanie.
Tom, I think there are still places in Germany you can find. One project that I love are the Stolpersteine that you find throughout in Germany and Austria, of course. These little markers in front of buildings where you can see who lived there, who was deported, where they died, birthdays. You can see family histories just by looking at the dates. And now we have a Stolper window with this installation you have, which is fantastic, I think, with having those films there. But one last comment or thought that I had was you talked about the danger of the fear of the other. I think there's also a danger in the extreme longing for belonging, because how can you define a group by really starting a hate campaign against all sorts of minorities? It's the extreme unifier, and I think this extreme longing for belonging might feed into your next panel where you talk about the place in the virtual world, and I can't wait to hear about that. So thank you.
Thank you for these last words, I think. Okay, thank you very much for coming and your interest. So let's go downstairs, have a glass of wine, and look if it works out. The film is already on display in the showroom. Thank you very much.